the history of British diplomacy in Pakistan. And it has just come out and looks at the long and extremely important history of this subject. We will have Professor Ian Talbot talking to us about the book, and we will also have Professor Mohammad Waseem from the Lahore University of Management Sciences and Ambassador Milam from California, who will be joining us. The Ambassador Milam has been ambassador to Pakistan, to Bangladesh. Professor Waseem has been a scholar of Pakistan's foreign policy for a long time, and Professor Talbot, of course, has been a scholar of Pakistan and South Asia in general in many ways. So we hope to have a really interesting conversation, which is already global by virtue of where all of my guests are located. So at one end of the planet, we have Ambassador Milam joining us from Sacramento, California. On the other end of the planet, nearly sort of, if you cut a hole through one, you might get out on the other. In Lahore, Pakistan, we have Professor Mohammad Waseem. I join you from Boston, and Ian Talbot joins us from Southampton in the United Kingdom. So this is already a global conversation, and global is important because British diplomacy in Pakistan is not just about Britain and Pakistan, maybe, but has implications historically and otherwise on certainly the region and elsewhere. It is also a subject that has been of some attention again in the last week, as both Britain and Pakistan and the rest of the world try to grapple about what to do with COVID. You suddenly realize that, like everything else, a pandemic is a matter of diplomacy. It is a matter of diplomacy in the rules you apply to who comes in, who doesn't, and so on and so forth. And that, as you would note, has been a subject of much conversation in recent weeks between Britain and between the United Kingdom and Pakistan. So that may also come up. But let me not bore you with more of myself. Let me ask Professor Talbot to take us on the journey that we are all eager to hear more about. Professor.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the Middle Institute for organizing this webinar. What I'm going to do initially is to just say a little bit about the scope of the book, and then I'm going to pick out some of the themes that run through it that may well spark conversation and questions as well from the audience. So this is the first study of the history of British diplomacy in Pakistan, looking at the High Commission, although for a time, of course, it functioned as an embassy when Pakistan left the Commonwealth under Zulfikar Ali Bhutto's decision. It's about not just the headquarters of the High Commission, which was in Karachi to start with, but then, of course, moved temporarily to Rawalpindi before settling finally in Islamabad. But it's also about the so-called outposts. These are the deputy high commissions in the Peshawar, Rawalpindi, Lahore, and of course in Dhaka up until 1971. And certainly no one has written about the role of these institutions before, although historians have used the appreciation reports produced by these outposts in writing and constructing narratives of Pakistan's history. And indeed, it was quite interesting when I came to research this subject to come across again some of the reports which I'd used in a very different context when I was writing the history of Pakistan. But this time round, I wasn't so much concerned with constructing a narrative from these reports, but seeing the way in which they'd been compiled and how they were produced and how they were reported back to Karachi or Islamabad and then forwarded to London, and the impact which they may have had on the policy-making process that was going on in London. So these are the sort of areas of institutional activity that I'm looking at: reporting, public diplomacy, economic diplomacy, that are all functions of a resident diplomatic mission. And as I say, I start this off in 1947 and really take it up into the so-called War on Terror, and cover those 7 decades, really, of British diplomatic activity in Pakistan. And in some respects, of course, this institutional history mirrors the history of Pakistan itself, in that the early High Commission, established in a very ad hoc basis in Wood Street, in the center of Karachi, in the aftermath of partition. Then, of course, there's the temporary move of the High Commission to Rawalpindi, which in the 1960s is very much reflective of the move of power to the military in Pakistan. And then, of course, finally, the early 21st century High Commission, existing very much in a security bubble within the diplomatic enclave in Islamabad. And you can just see by looking at these different sort of physical spaces in which the High Commission operated, changes within Pakistan's domestic politics. But of course, the diplomacy that was being carried out in the High Commission and in the outpost was also occurring in a very changing environment internationally, in terms of South Asia, initially the Cold War, then later, of course, the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan and all the fallout from that. And then finally, as I've said in the closing chapter, the war on terror. Pakistan itself has changed in these years. And of course, Britain has also changed in this period of time as well. And the medium through which diplomacy could be carried out, the rise of so-called digital diplomacy in the 21st century, is another changing context for looking at British diplomatic activity. So that's really the scope of the book. Some of the themes which I pick up in the book. Firstly, I make the argument that despite Britain's decline in global power since 1947, it has continued to play a significant role within Pakistan itself. So one of the questions that I set myself was to try and explain how Britain was able to use the cliche punch above its weight in terms of its diplomatic influence in Pakistan, and what could explain this. And there are a number of factors, of course, which could explain this: soft power, the role of English language, of the British Council, even of the BBC. All of these things play a part in Britain's soft power influence in Pakistan. But I also raise 2 other issues. One is the targeting, particularly in the recent years, of relatively limited aid, certainly in relation to what the United States can provide, but targeting this. And Britain has certainly targeted aid in areas like education, gender empowerment. These are particular emphases which the High Commission has picked up in recent times. But the other element, I think, which is important and which runs throughout the volume, is what has been the colonial legacy, and how has this perhaps in some respects got in the way of British influence, but in other ways forwarded British influence in Pakistan. And in a sense, is this sort of historical tie and embedded knowledge and understanding of Pakistan been a factor in trying to explain how Britain has been able to punch above its weight diplomatically in the country. And I look at this in terms of both the experience of old India hands in diplomacy in Pakistan in the early years. For example, the first deputy high commissioner based in Dhaka, Leonard Coke Wallace, had first been posted to Bengal in 1924. So he has a wealth of experience in that region. Many of the deputy high commissioners based in Peshawar, Lahore, Rawalpindi also could draw on years of experience. Of course, there isn't necessarily an institutional memory, but nonetheless, I think there are these connections and understandings which Britain has, which perhaps other countries haven't got that same background in terms of coming to terms with Pakistan society. And I argue throughout the volume that personal connections, personal diplomacy is actually very important in the Pakistan context, in that Pakistan society runs very much on lines of a small military political elite, and one in which personal connections are actually very important in getting things done. And that if you're going to be successful diplomatically, you've got to be able to access these connections. And Britain may well have had some advantages from this. And this carries on, indeed, this interest in Pakistan society that individual high commissioners have, and even historical connections, almost down to the contemporary period. In the 1990s, Nicholas Barrington, a long-standing high commissioner, was so interested in Pakistan society that he developed genealogical charts of leading landowning families in Pakistan. And obviously, we go forward a little bit from his time. Mark Lyle Grant, of course, had family connections. His great-great-uncle was the founder of Lyallpur, Islamabad, in Pakistan. So you can see that there are still these connections that Britain is able perhaps to deploy as a result of this colonial past. But I said earlier, of course, that there are also maybe drawbacks as well as advantages. And one of these drawbacks, of course, is that Britain has often disappointed Pakistan in its sort of tightrope balancing act between Pakistan and India, particularly vis-a-vis the Kashmir issue. And the attempts at being even-handed have sometimes, I think, disappointed people within Pakistan who were looking for more from Britain. So there is also some drawbacks as well as advantages coming out of this colonial history. If we move forward, I think the final theme which runs through this book, which I'm going to mention very briefly, is that Britain has obviously been a junior partner of the United States really since the mid-1950s, but that Britain has worked quite closely with the United States to further interest within Pakistan. They haven't always, the two countries, seen eye to eye. They've sometimes had different strategies, different emphases, but there has been quite a close working relationship. And what the book brings out really is how this operated at the grassroots level of field diplomacy in Pakistan. There's often written about the special relationship and the role of prime ministers and presidents and summitry, but there are examples in this book of how at the level of the headquarters, High Commission, American Embassy, but even out in the outposts, people have tended to, Americans and Britons have tended to work, sometimes to reinforce diplomatic messages or to share information and that's been quite an important feature, I think, of British diplomacy in Pakistan. I could say a lot more, but I think probably now is the time to stop. But I hope I've given some kind of flavor of what this book is about.
Adil, you're on mute.
Apologies for that. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I want to move to Professor Waseem shortly, and there are already some very interesting comments coming in. But Professor, if I can push you or ask you just one question that might help the comments we received from our discussants. What surprised you in this research? What did you find that you were not expecting to?
I wasn't expecting, I think, when I started off, that Britain would still have the degree of influence that it has in Pakistan. I mean, if you look at Britain's position in other parts of the former colonial world, there's often a very different story of resentment, of animosity, and of limited influence. I think what comes across in terms of the Pakistan case, is that actually this colonial past could be an asset in terms of contemporary relationships, not necessarily to drag those relationships down, but they often have done in other contexts.
Thank you. That is a very interesting observation, and I'll take that to Professor Waseem, but I will also highlight a comment we already got from Ambassador Simmons, who was ambassador to Pakistan, who points out that he says, isn't it also true that Pakistan felt and feel that they were liberated from the threat of Hindu dominance in a free India rather than from Britain? And that might actually impact what you just said about the relationship with Britain. In some ways, I think Mountbatten was able to deflect that sort of colonial legacy quite well. And I'm not sure whether the subcontinent benefited or otherwise from this, but this is a very interesting observation, both from you and from Ambassador Simmons, that at least for Pakistan, the story of independence is not simply a story of independence from British rule. It gets much more complicated because of partition and how history then got formed. But that is my view. Let me go to someone whose views are much more legitimate than mine. Professor Waseem.
Hello. I must rush through because of the limited time. I have three major perspectives on the book. And before that, I must say that more than a history of diplomacy, frankly, what I found in the book was history through diplomacy. Here was diplomatic activity, but actually I was looking at history from a particular perspective, of course, which was Ian Talbot's research, and there it is. But basically what I got enlightened by was actually the history itself, but it was activated through diplomacy. My takeaway, for example, about diplomacy and foreign policy overlapping with each other was excellent. Here it is that there were individual high commissioners in Karachi and in Delhi. Karachi High Commissioner Gravity Smith, for example, was overly pro-India, pro-Pakistan, and of course, Ambassador, the High Commissioner over there in Delhi was similarly inclined towards India. That leads to an interesting observation. Here, you live in an atmosphere where you read papers, where you watch TV, where whatever goes on all around you, that actually has an impact on you. And you become, while you are the ambassador of your country, also to some extent, ambassador of your surroundings. And that was an interesting takeaway, I must say. And of course, I'll say that there are some other kinds of diplomacy which I came to know by the word, for example, like economic diplomacy, because of the fact that there were British commercial interests, particularly in East Pakistan, but also in Karachi. and of course, some kind of military diplomacy, in the sense, at least negatively speaking, that government of Pakistan tried to stop one US military diplomat, let's say Reed, who was constantly visiting GHQ. That was not very much liked. And of course, there is the grassroots diplomacy, the term used by my friend, where, of course, you issue visas, and by way of trade, you tend to cultivate relations. And interestingly, diaspora diplomacy. Quite a few Pakistanis living in England, they do have a kind of an impact, at least at the constituency level, from where then the elected representatives would operate as a lobby. And he has picked up, for example, the biradari basis of the vote pattern in certain areas of concentration of Pakistanis, the vote blocking. So there it is. Digital diplomacy. Very nice. He has already mentioned it. And of course, in the book, I read it. The profile of a blogging high commissioner. And in fact, he has used the word naked diplomat, only armed with one mobile phone, which is again interesting. And there is a kind of a profile diplomacy as well. Of course, in Pakistan, for example, the British diplomats sometimes feel obliged to answer, or at least to deal with questions about like Islamophobia in England and so on. So keeping that aside, I like to pick up a bit on the relations or communication or partnership or otherwise between the UK and US embassies. How were these two sets of diplomats in Pakistan interact with each other? And there I found some very interesting remarks. For example, I felt, and he rightly pointed it out, that there was the incoming imperialism and there was the outgoing imperialism. And the two met, and they had their own preferences, of course, and priorities. And again, UK, I hope it's not very ethnocentric on his part, but the way he described it, the UK diplomats would be cool and level-headed. Ambassador Milam is sitting here. And he says that the US diplomats were, well, a bit proactive, let's say. And that was, in a way, a kind of a difference of profile, let's say. In the perspective of Kashmir, Washington tried to, in a way, restrain the British policy of internationalization of the issue. But overall, what happened over the decades, let's say, that UK had a South Asian perspective on Pakistan, whereas United States looked at it in the overall Cold War perspective, and there it set its priorities, for example, vis-a-vis Indian friendship treaty with the Soviet Union at that time, and so on. And that would set, in a way, the pattern of Washington's friendship with Islamabad. And particularly in the perspective of the 1971 war, here was a dichotomous pattern emerging: the UK's tilt towards India and Washington, the United States tilt towards Pakistan. Nixon was very much for Yahya at that time. And here the two attitudes, in a way, collided. And Ian also talked about diplomacy at the desk, how diplomats, in a way, judged and pruned and distilled information in Islamabad, and only then they would send it to London, whereas the Americans tended to, what he uses the word, fire off information, whatever there was, straight away to Washington. And finally, I would like to talk about, for example, Pakistani politics through a diplomatic eye. I feel he has picked up, the author has picked up that particular perspective For example, here was a country he describes, which was punching diplomatically above its weight. Very interesting. Even today, probably somebody will be writing about it. East Bengal, here was rigging which took place at that time in the early 1950s that actually has set the pattern for the coming 70 years that has been happening all around. Rigged election is at the very heart of the politics of Pakistan. And of course, I picked up again a kind of a dichotomy between the traditionalists and modernists. Here was the traditionalist aspect, for example, Qayyum Khan, Chief Minister of KP, talking about the obscurantist mullah who is taking us to the darkness of the medieval times. And there is on the other side, the modernist, the state manager, who was trying to steer the way to the other side. Military government, here comes the coup d'etat, 1958. Amazingly, it was much foretold. 2 or 3 times it had been talked, a few months before the coup and 2 days before the coup, whatever. And what is very intriguing here, I find a kind of a Huntingtonian paradigm because the British ambassador likes Ayub government, probably the best government from partition, because it has brought stability. That is to be noted. At that time, this was the popular framework of thought about the third world, particularly Pakistan. And finally, I would point out a little about the Queen's visit 1961. Here, there were thrilled crowds. I was wondering, was it a colonial hangover at that time? Imagine today's Pakistan. It's full of anti-Western feelings. And would there be crowds again? Would they be out there? Would they be chanting Elizabeth Zindabad, as he has mentioned in his book? Amazing. So these were a few observations of mine. I hope I haven't gone beyond my fixed time. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. There's a lot in there and a lot to unpack. I will move directly to Ambassador Milam. Ambassador, it is not a surprise how often the United States has come into this conversation about British diplomacy in Pakistan. Professor Talbot calls the United Kingdom a junior partner to the US. Professor Waseem talks about an incoming and an outgoing imperialism. And much of our already comments are on that. How do you see the book and its lessons, including the conversation we've had thus far?
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me, and thank you to everybody who's watching. I guess I'm here because of the partnership that, no matter who was junior, between the U.S. and U.S. diplomats in Pakistan and British diplomats in Pakistan. I must say that quite often I felt like the junior partner. So I'm not sure that Ian was correct in that respect always, but he's mostly correct. I think simply because for a long time we were doing more in terms of aid, but different kinds of aid. I think, as a matter of fact, one of the things I would have argued is that I thought, well, when I was in Pakistan, I might add, there was no aid program, so it's hard for me to judge. But I've been in Pakistan many times since I was there, and I think our aid programs have steered the wrong way, whereas I more admire the British programs. But that's neither here nor there in this kind of conversation. Let me say the first thing that caught me about the book, and Ian mentioned it at the end of his talk, was the use of need for personal diplomacy in South Asia. I learned this actually in Bangladesh, which where I was 4 or 5 years earlier than I was in Pakistan. And I learned it from my British counterpart, actually, who was very well wired in. And I realized, I came to realize that you needed to really use personal diplomacy there, where I had served in countries before that where it didn't seem quite so necessary. In any case, uh, I will mention, I think, somebody we've already heard from. My predecessor in Pakistan was Tom Simon, and the only briefing I got on the way to Islamabad was one day in London when he and I spent the day talking. And he not only emphasized the idea of personal diplomacy as being the key to success, he also emphasized that I should get to know the Chief of Army Staff better than anybody else in Pakistan. And I did. And that was quite a good advice. I will thank Tom publicly right now for giving it to me. The Chief of Army Staff, Karamat, was fired about 3 days after I arrived in Pakistan because he had said something down in Lahore that the Prime Minister didn't like. And so I don't even think I had called on him yet, and when he got fired, but I did call on him anyway after he got fired, and we got to be good friends. But I made a point, because that was as soon as General Musharraf was appointed as chief, I made it a point to get to know him. And so when a year or so later, he became what they called chief executive at the time, I had an extremely good relationship with the chief executive too. So personal diplomacy was a very important part of what I've learned, and I learned it basically in Dhaka, not in Islamabad, but I practice it more in Islamabad. Although I don't want to talk about Bangladesh, but I had arrived there just as they were pushing General Ershad out, and I got to know a number of the leaders of the opposition because they were at that point quite friendly to the United States and seeking me out all the time, as was Ershad, by the way. So I'll emphasize, I'll talk about one more thing, which is something that I can't talk about very academically, but Ian mentioned several times, and it's been mentioned elsewhere, the legacy of colonialism. There are a lot of bad things coming from colonialism. I know that, but I thought the British had an advantage when I was in South Asia, both in Bangladesh and Pakistan, in the sense that they seem to have been there so much longer and to have known so much more than we did, that that is why I think there was, between me and my counterparts, my British counterparts, and among most of my predecessors and successors and their British counterparts, a very productive and quite often, I think, very useful partnership. Particularly with Hilary Sinnott, who gets a lot of mention in your book, Ian, I had a very close relationship and found him to be an extremely good friend. The friendship continued after we had both left Pakistan, I might add. But anyway, that's about all I have to say at the beginning. I think I will turn it over to people who can speak a little bit more substantively than I can.
Before we open up, and we have wonderful comments here that I do want to get to, and questions, but Professor Talbot, any reactions from to what you just heard?
I think a couple of points really I want to pick up on. Firstly, from Waseem, I think that one of the hangovers of partition for the British was this difference of opinion in government circles that goes back to the colonial period. Those who tended to be pro-Pakistan had been pro-Muslim League in their attitudes before 1947, particularly on the military side, but it wasn't just on the military side. And those who were obviously more pro-India connections, and here we talk about Attlee in the immediate sort of aftermath of partition with Congress. So that there was almost a continuation of this sort of Congress Muslim League sort of attitudes into government circles. And this was a factor, I think, in the responses when the Kashmir issue emerged so quickly, immediately after independence. And that continuation, of course, it is something which I suppose never got out of hand, because certainly Britain, and I'm not sure whether the United States did this, and perhaps Ambassador Milam would be able to inform us more, but there were a lot of people who moved in their careers between the High Commission in New Delhi and the High Commission in Karachi or Islamabad. And there almost seemed to be a career pattern, you know, where people served on both sides of the border, which of course was very useful at times of crisis because they had connections in both countries. And also I think it prevented them becoming overly partisan in terms of their support for either India or Pakistan. And I think that was very much a feature after this early post-independence sort of division really in outlook. But I don't know whether the United States did have this sort of policy of moving people between India and Pakistan.
Maybe if I can get to some of the comments, Professor Talbot, because one of them is very much related to what you just said, and it is about sort of your discussion of the advice given to Pakistan by British High Commissioner diplomats right before 1971 and 1970 and the breakup of Pakistan and what is the creation of what is now Bangladesh. And so something about that, but the real question within that is also being asked by Stephen Wilkinson there is that was the fact that so many of the UK diplomats were former colonial officials helpful or not in providing accurate assessments, either in advice to Pakistan or an assessment of what was happening in Pakistan?
I think to go to that last point, obviously there are pros and cons here. The depth of knowledge and connections that these people were able to bring was very different to that of any other country in the immediate post-independence period. So that was an advantage. But obviously, in a way, of course, people from that colonial period took their mindsets with them into the post-colonial period. And that in itself could be a distorting factor. So on the one hand, they have these sort of embedded knowledge of the country, which is quite unique. But on the other hand, this may have been produced within a particular frame. And as I've already said, there were certainly those people who had a very much a pro-Muslim League, pro-Pakistan view that they took after independence, which obviously impacted the way in which they would report on events, perhaps relating to the Indo-Pakistan sort of contest, particularly over Kashmir. So there are these sort of downsides as well as upsides. But I think what really struck me, because I think Adil asked me at the beginning, what was it that when I was embarked on this research I wasn't expecting? And it was this continuation after independence of these connections and of people who had served in the subcontinent in the colonial era continuing afterwards. And of course, this was mirrored in 1947-48 in other ways as well, because the first governors of key provinces in Pakistan, the governors of Punjab, governor of the frontier, as it was then called, were Britons. Many of the high-ranking positions in the military were held by Britons down into almost the mid-1950s. And there is this sort of almost transition, long transition, which is going on. Of course, Pakistan had to do this because it didn't necessarily have the experienced personnel that was able to take over immediately after independence. So there was this sort of hangover, really, of the partition and colonial period, and that the extent to which this existed, it surprised me.
Professor Waseem or Ambassador Milam, any reactions to either of those questions or what Professor Talbot was saying?
Well, if I was going to react to something that you asked about, or maybe it was Ian who raised it, people moving between posts. We had a whole cadre of what I would call South Asian specialists, and which I sort of broke into from outside, but there were quite a number of people in this who served in both India, Pakistan, and other South Asian countries in the Foreign Service when I was in it. And one of my successors, who I think Ian spoke to a lot, was Nancy Powell, who I believe served in every South Asian country that there is. I'm not sure about Sri Lanka, but she was posted at one time or another in every other South Asian country. So there were others who were of the same, I think, like that, like Howie Schaefer, who was ambassador in Bangladesh prior to me. So yeah, we had our cadre of South Asian specialists who were probably didn't have the depth of knowledge that, particularly at the beginning, that the British would have had because of their colonial heritage. But I suspect, although I haven't talked to them, that they probably took the same lessons from the British that I took. And I learned them actually mostly in Bangladesh and not in Pakistan. The value of personal diplomacy, for example, and other things about how to conduct yourself and how to get information that you needed and to report it. By the way, speaking of reporting, the one thing I took issue with, and it was not you, Ian, who said it. You were quoting somebody early in the book about somebody in the 40s or 50s, I guess, who said the Americans just fired off telegrams. Believe me, they did not. All telegrams most telegrams, except for the sort of administrative ones, have to go through several series of people who check to see that they should go and that they're well done and so forth. So I took issue with that. But other than that, I thought the book was rather good, and I'm glad I played a little teeny bit of role in it. The other thing I want to say, and this really gets back to something Ian said earlier about Pakistan changing. But as I have gone along and followed Pakistan, the one thing that's dawned on me, and really with great force now, I've come to believe it more and more, is that Pakistan fundamentally never changes. And I don't believe it. I'm not sure it ever will. And that's because, and I will give you the illustration of not too long ago, a couple of months ago, I was listening in a situation like this, a Zoom event, to a discussion of Pakistani politics, what the parties are doing and so forth. And I just kept thinking, well, wait a minute, what difference does this make? it's the army that's going to call the shots. And so, you know, that's something you learn probably from being in Pakistan. But anyway, I think that Pakistan has changed in some ways, but that fundamental has not changed. So that, I don't know, I probably didn't answer your question, Adil, but I've answered my own.
You've also raised a number of others, and I do want to get to some other ones that have come up, but Waseem Saab, I wanted to give you the floor. Any quick reactions to where the conversation is before we move to a very interesting question that's been raised, which I am also seeking an answer to.
Something about American diplomats being assertive. From that, I picked up that there was diplomacy in a new country, so to say. For America, Latin America would have been the backyard, the traditional sort of pay field. But here, particularly not India, but Pakistan, that was something new. So from 1948 onwards, actually, Governor General and the Prime Minister had been trying to connect with Washington in the perspective of the overall insecurity that was felt here. But there was a kind of a lackluster response from Washington till something happened in Iran, and there was a crisis. And of course, Washington started looking for somebody else, some other country in the region where they can come in, let's say, because India was in a way non-obliging because of its policy of non-alignment. And there then, finally, the door was open. So what I'm saying here is that the British were, in a way, structurally present here and continue to be, whereas the American diplomacy was more functional. Here it was, here the need arose, there was some vacuum and they filled in, and whenever that there was no need, for example, straight after 1965 or later on in certain times, there was a withdrawal of a kind. Americans were not so much interested till Soviet Union would come, for example, in 1979, or there was 9/11. So what I'm saying is that the Americans would come in to do something. The British were there by fiat, let's say. Yeah.
Thank you for that. A comment and then a question that's been raised, Professor Talbot, and the comment simply is because you mentioned and Professor Waseem mentioned sort of the changing face of diplomacy, new technologies, personalized diplomacy, and sort of diplomacy by blogs and diplomacy by Twitter. I had mentioned the current sort of little storm, if you will, whether in a teacup or not, that is going on about sort of Britain putting restrictions on British nationals flying in from Pakistan, and on Pakistan, but not on other countries. And when anyone from Pakistan says other countries, they mean India, despite the same profile. But the comment I wanted to make was, it was interesting that the British ambassador comes on Twitter to make that announcement, and to make it with, you know, all due apology and sort of speaks directly to people in Pakistan and those who might have been planning those flights, rather than through usual means of communiques and announcements, or even going to the Foreign Office, etc. So that I think sort of in many ways validates what you are saying and what we are seeing in diplomacy, not just between Britain and Pakistan, but everywhere. But the question I wanted to raise, which has been raised and is a very important one, is we've talked a lot about the US, as one would expect, certainly about the United Kingdom. The country that hasn't come up, but is the other one big in this playing field, is China. So do you have any thoughts on that, either historically or at the current point? In sort of especially this current situation where junior senior partners has become a different sort of game, with the rise of this power that has had historically very close relations with Pakistan and continues to have very deep ties with Pakistan.
I think as far as China is concerned, one of the points which comes out really is that Pakistan's whole foreign policy is Indo-centric. And really the interest in China becomes much more significant after the 1962 war between India and China. And that begins this relationship, which is cliched called an all-weather sort of friendship relationship between China and Pakistan. And in a sense, I suppose, it reflects the fact that at various moments of time, both the United States and the UK has been seen to have let Pakistan down. They may not have done in reality, but that is the perception within Pakistan. Whereas China is seen as a country which has always stood by Pakistan. And obviously, there's that long history. And then, of course, the rise of Chinese economic power and its ambitions in the last decade or so have, I think, sort of fed into this sort of long-standing possibility that China could be a future ally against India as far as Pakistan is concerned, because Pakistan is always looking to sort of equalize itself with India, you know, and the United States has support militarily has been one factor in that in the long term. China could be another factor, though perhaps equalizing Pakistan more economically than militarily. And obviously Pakistan's geostrategic position, you know, does make it important for China's sort of ambitions.
Would you say, going back to the question, is there any UK-China diplomacy that is impacted in Islamabad? Not of the nature of sort of Kissinger going through Pakistan to Beijing, but is Islamabad a venue for any UK-China relations, or not really?
I mean, obviously at the moment, the situation is very much being dominated by what's happening in Hong Kong. And that's something which has always been there, actually, in British diplomatic attitudes towards China. And it's the Hong Kong issue, which is really, perhaps along with the pandemic, soured relations as far as Britain and China are concerned. Pakistan, of course, has sometimes played a route for Western powers to China. You know, we were talking a little bit earlier about this shift of the United States, this tilt of the United States towards Pakistan in the 1971 context. You know, and the Nixon administration, as far as I understand it, was very much pro-Yahya at that time, despite the reports which were coming out from Dhaka particularly about sort of atrocities that were being carried out there, because of the fact that Nixon and Kissinger had been using sort of Pakistan as a route to connect with China in the context of the Sino-Soviet split. So I think that element, you know, is always there, that China is both a friend against India for Pakistan. It's also, I think, there in terms of this wider sort of geostrategic position that Pakistan plays, which some historians and analysts have said has been to the detriment of Pakistan, but the connectivity could also in the long run be to Pakistan's advantage. But obviously, China is going to be an important player in that context.
As we come to the end of our time, if you allow me two very quick rapid fire questions and maybe just a line or two of answer on each, and I'll go through each one of you if you allow me. Starting with you, Waseem Saab, if you might. First, if you look towards the future, as Professor Talbot does towards the end of the book, what would you see as the most important challenge or opportunity in UK-Pakistan relations? Or diplomacy, UK-Pakistan diplomacy?
Well, it's in the larger context of acceptability of Pakistan as a legitimate player on the international stage. There is a feeling here in Pakistan and probably abroad that there is a kind of an isolation within the region. And when we go out to Europe, there that feeling is sometimes present. Now, what will happen after Brexit? Are we going to deal with European Union as a whole, including Britain? Of course, they are now two separate entities, but still, yeah, there is a kind of a special relationship, particularly in the context of emigre population over there, diaspora, almost 1 million more. So there is a special concern, and we still depend quite a lot educationally, media-wise, and historically, particularly in terms of laws and, of course, in terms of the judiciary, its activities and all that. It is a post-colonial state, and that binds us very closely with United Kingdom. That doesn't mean operationally all the time, but there is a structural presence of England within Pakistan. Yes.
Ambassador Milam, whether junior partner or equal partner, how do you see any role for UK-Pakistan diplomacy in how the region is moving from an American perspective? You know, as we speak, the Russian foreign minister is visiting Pakistan. As we speak, there seems to be sort of a pushback from the US to cut sort of Pakistan to size, or maybe ask it to nudge away from China. So there's a lot happening in that region. The rise of China, the Belt and Road, Afghanistan, India is always there. As you see all of this, what do you see as future challenges, opportunities?
Well, I think the challenge is going to be related to China, which prompts me to say that in the last 20 years, I think the role of China has changed quite a lot in South Asia and in Pakistan. It's funny, we didn't, in my time, which was only 20 years ago, China didn't seem to be come up very often. Yes, it was a steady friend of Pakistan. Yes. And it was a moderating influence. For example, when Nawaz Sharif flew off to China to see if he could get some help with the Kargil situation, the Chinese told him to go back and make peace with India. As far as I think that's a correct view. I remember believing it then, but China has now become much more aggressive and I think probably much closer to Pakistan than it was. Closer in an emotional sense, because while the Chinese were there and there was always this sort of very steady friendship, well, we didn't think much about China back in those days. At least I didn't. Getting to the UK, I think the UK can play because they have the same kind of deep relationship with Pakistan, and ours has been too bumpy. I think I think the UK could play a role in some of the issues that are really affecting and worrying the US. Even Afghanistan, they could be helpful, but particularly with India, it strikes me that where the U.S. is either too pro-Indian or not pro-Indian enough, and so we don't seem to be able to help much with trying to bring those two countries together in some sort of understanding that would reduce tensions between them. And I'm running out of time, so I'll stop there. But anyway.
Thank you. We are indeed running out of time, but last word to Professor Talbot. What do you see, having done this research? What is the big question before UK-Pakistan diplomacy in the coming future?
I think that the big issue really for post-Brexit Britain is how it balances its interest in India and in Pakistan. I think there's a big push on at the moment towards India and the Indo-Pacific, and that will inevitably impact on relations with Pakistan. And in a way, I think it's exaggerating this tightrope, which I mentioned earlier, which has always been there in terms of how does Britain, with its commitments to both India and Pakistan as Commonwealth countries, with this colonial background, how does it balance its interests for India and Pakistan? And I think that that will be the big issue going forward as far as relations are concerned. And also, one final point, the diaspora. There's this large Pakistani diaspora in the UK, which is very influential. How would this diaspora react if Britain moved very closely tilting towards India? What would be the implications for the diaspora?
Never a dull moment in any diplomacy in Pakistan, or maybe anywhere. Diplomacy is always a balancing act, and good words to end on that this is going to remain a balancing act both for Pakistan and for the UK. Thank you very much, Professor Talbot, for writing the book. Thank you very much for letting us discuss the book. Thank you very much to Ambassador Milam and Professor Waseem for joining us, and for Professor Talbot to spend time with all of us. And most of all, thank you to all who have been listening or might be seeing the recording. Have a wonderful day, and may all diplomacy reach diplomatic solutions always.